So let's go back to the early 20th century and look at some of the modern Sikh movements after the Singh Sabha period. So that's what we've been doing. We've been looking at the modern Singh Sabha period in previous lectures. In short, the earlier Singh Sabha movement evolves into a body called the Chief Khalsa Diwan. This happens in the early 20th century after, you remember there were two Singh Sabhas. One was the Amritsar Singh Sabha, the Lahore Singh Sabha. These two bodies competed with each other. They became factionalized and in a sense were unable to really make full use of the advantage that Sikhs had, especially in regard to the British. The British looked upon the Sikhs quite favorably, or certainly began to look at them favorably from the 1890s onwards, after more and more Sikhs were coming into the army, etc. But local politics was very factionalized, and so these two bodies ended up having to merge with each other because they simply couldn't compete with the rising Hindu nationalist politics, which is becoming very well coordinated indeed. So a body was created called the Chief Khalsa Diwan. So Chief Khalsa Diwan was the official representative body for Sikhs. Most of what it did was organize education conferences and sent members onto the board of certain key political boards, representation to the British, etc. Most of its actual rhetoric, when it pleaded with the British government, for example, is mostly to do with reclaiming historical gurdwaras. Most of these gurdwaras were in the hands of Mahants. The presence of Mahants was bitterly contested at the grassroots level, particularly by the Tat Khalsa factions of the Singh Sabha. So the Chief Khalsa Diwan inherits that rhetoric and in a sense pleads with the British government to give back the historical gurdwaras under Sikh control, because the Mahants were not regarded as a kind of a Sikh body at all. The problem with these Chief Khalsa Diwan, however, is that, and Khushwant Singh has a very nice term for this. He says that these people were essentially toadies of the British. They mostly pandered to the British in order to keep their positions intact. And so, in a sense, their political efforts were compromised by the leadership's desire to work within the constitutional framework set up by the British governments. And this was a real problem. So in a sense, all they could do was simply make pleas on municipal boards. And at the grassroots level, they were perceived as being too loyal to the British. They were mostly the elite sections of Sikh society, the very well-educated ones, mostly those educated in English. And there was too much of a gap between them and mostly the farming sort of communities. Now this grassroots discontent had been building since at least the 1890s. So it's been building for some time against the kind of elite Sikh leadership. Chief Khalsa Diwan was unable to contain grassroots agitation by peasant farmers for a number of things. Peasant farmers at that time were becoming increasingly indebted to moneylenders. The money-lending class was both the British, but even more so was Baniyas, were Hindu Baniyas. Both of these classes were extorting very large land revenues, which were indebting farmers even more. So they were getting into a cycle of debt and then eventual either going into alcoholism or suicide. Very much, these kind of cycles have been happening for the last 100 years or so. We see them happening every sort of 20, 30 years. There's a period in which farmers do well, then external events happen, and this kind of cycle takes place. So at that time, though, there was a number of successive famines that took place, which really depleted Punjab quite badly, and suicides were becoming more and more frequent, particularly amongst the farmers. And the British were also perceived as being completely insensitive to Sikh demands, not just the Sikhs but also the Sikh elites as well. So there is a very genuine grassroots discontent that's perceivable at that time, and this eventually morphs into a kind of agitation over a period of time. But we don't actually see this agitation within Punjab itself. We see it actually from outside, and interestingly, it comes from almost 8,000 miles away in the form of the Ghadar movement,